Welcome to another edition of the Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and we continue to examine public policy in Guyana, especially the interface between foreign policy and domestic policy. In Guyana, as you know, today we are at the start of the month of May. And one thing all Guyanese know that the May-June rains never fail, and the rains have started. And this season is going to be ominous. It's going to be ruinous. Uh, the Hydrometeorological Service has already predicted above normal rainfall. Rainfall and flash floods are expected to peak in May and June. Water levels in conservancies and reservoirs and rivers are expected to increase. Already, in some areas of the quarantine, cattle farmers are moving their animals out of the fields to higher ground. So everybody in Guyana is looking forward, unfortunately, to a very bad season, perhaps worse than we had in 2021. We're speaking about climate change, and climate change affects every sector of the society and economy. It affects how people eat, how they live, how they travel, how they work. And allow me to refer again to Barakara community up the Kanji Creek. Nicolita Amsterdam is a mother of three. She lives by farming in order to look after her family, her children. Last year, during the rains, the May-June rains, she saw her crops and livestock being destroyed. And yes, they did receive some assistance, but what they did is they received some seeds and some tools, cutlasses and shovels. They didn't get any Hymax. Those Hymax go to other areas, but up the Kanji Creek, literally up the creek, whatever they received was insufficient. And up to now, they have not received what is called the flood relief package. So there she is, a mother of three. She has not been able to restart large-scale public cultivation. And now we are at the beginning of the current May-June rains, which means that she is probably going to have to endure several more months of being unable to produce her crops and to sell them in the market. That is a situation that climate change creates in our country. Every single region of our country is affected by climate change. The coastland, where most people live, 90% of the people live on the coastland. The grasslands, these are the hinterland savannas and the Bobby savannas. The highlands, the mountainous areas, the islands in the Essequibo estuary, the lowlands, the wetlands, swampy lands, the rainforests. And don't forget, in addition to the rainforest, we have other forms of forest, particularly the mangrove forests, because those are forests as well. The rivers are affected because they bring a lot of silt down, from the hinterland, and most of Guyanese rivers run from south to north, emptying in the Atlantic. The lakes in the Essequibo, in the Pomeroon Supernam region, the waterfalls, every single part of this country will be affected by climate change. And all of us, at every level, at the personal level, at the neighborhood level, at the national level, must be concerned with protecting our environment so that we can reduce the adverse effects of climate change. We cannot solve the world's climate change problem, but all of us can help to make Guyana a better place to live in. Our country, Guyana, is at risk from sea level rise, which could, as you know, most of the coast is already below the level of the ocean at high tide, but it can exceed 10 millimeters annually. And the global annual average is 2 to 4 millimeters. So Guyana is above average in terms of sea level rise. Sea level rise threatens the entire coastal built environment. That is the structures we have built, particularly our homes and our business places. It affects the mangroves, which protect our coastline. It affects agriculture. It affects, the freshwater resources, because, in fact, salt water has already started to intrude into some of the aquifers. Um, Indeed, as you know, the Rupununi is the driest region of Guyana. It's largely grassland. And our government had to ask the Brazilian army, the construction engineer battalion, to help us with the construction of wells. So South Rupununi now has about half a dozen wells, um, to see it through the droughts. And of course, when the floods come, they are now creating reservoirs so that the rainfall would run into the reservoirs, and when the dry season comes, there'll be water stored for use, especially for feeding animals. Guyana has a very low-lying coastal zone. In many respects, we're like uh, there's some small low-lying states, island states. But we are not an island, of course, but our entire coastline is low-lying. And this coastland, as you know, those of you who live uh, on the coastland, the coastline is characterized by intertidal mudflats. And of course, there are some narrow, small sand and shell beaches and mangrove forests. And all of these are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Mangrove forests are particularly important. And when you see people destroying mangrove forests, stop them, report them to the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. Mangroves are essential to the protection of our coastal zone. Coastal zone management is impossible without the mangroves. Once you cut down the mangroves, you have to use concrete and maintain that concrete. But the mangroves should be replenished, replanted. And there have been people over the last few months, people who get drunk with oil. People get drunk with oil and they start cutting down the mangroves. So we have to be very careful. The mangroves are a natural protective barrier on the shoreline. They are a natural carbon store. So they are performing the functions of trees, of forests. They're not just there as a nuisance to fishermen. They are important to the protection of our country. They support nutrient and organic matter processing and sediment control for inshore habitats. They serve as the spawning ground habitat for marine species and wildlife habitats. I had a personal experience, which I must tell you about, flying over the mangroves to see a flock of scarlet ibises. There's nothing more beautiful than that, to see the scarlet ibises against the green mangroves. I can't imagine what would happen to our scarlet ibises if we cut down the mangroves. And I think later on in the program, you'll see an image of trees, because the scarlet ibises, of course, live on the trees, and those trees are on the coastland of Guyana. They are mangroves, and those mangroves have to be protected. Uh, in the hinterland, too, we have faced a problem of deforestation. Um, okay, Guyana is very famous for its green heart and for its timber, but when those trees are cut down and not replanted, it could lead, the process could lead to desertification and deforestation. Mining also. When you look at some of those mined out areas where OMI used to be, especially in region 7 and region 8, those mined out areas are like sores, they're like abscesses. Nothing grows there. And sometimes there's reckless farming, slash and burn. And although it could be said that Guyana has been able to preserve part of its forest covers, too much land is being deforested because of mining, logging, and reckless agriculture. And we need to be careful, because once the trees are cut down, the animal and plant species which depend on those trees will be diminished or will disappear. And I have a saying, I'm told it was an Amerindian saying, the trees hold up the sky, and if you cut down the trees, the sky will fall. The lack of trees, therefore, will allow the release of a greater volume of greenhouse gases. So, in a way, by cutting down the trees, we contribute to climate change. In fact, we do not benefit from cutting down the trees. The trees are more valuable to us standing than being cut down and used as firewood. So we have to be careful with deforestation. And right now, there's no plan in place to protect our country, hinterland or coastland, from deforestation. As I said a minute ago, they're even cutting down the mangroves on the coastline. You can imagine what happened in the hinterland, which more people cannot see, many people cannot see. The lack of trees will allow a greater volume of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and it will contribute to coastal flooding. It will contribute to soil erosion. So, my friends, we are not out of the woods, literally, and we need, if you are concerned about climate change, we need to be very careful about coastal zone management. Now, last year, this PPP administration deemed the floods, which we saw between April and July, to be the worst in the country's history. These are not my words. These are the words of the government. The 2021 floods were the worst in the country's history. Every single region was affected. Even remote communities, and particularly the riverine communities, and I just mentioned Barakar up the Kanji Creek, was severely affected, and the residents there have not recovered. They have not been given flood relief grants, and they have not recovered. So we are now emerging from last year's worst flood in the country's history. And the expectation is that this year's flood will be very severe. Of course, you cannot say if it will be worse than last year, but it is unlikely to be much improvement, if at all. The May-June season last year affected hundreds of farmers, and it is calculated that $23 billion worth of cash crops, of cattle, of poultry, of machinery were impacted, damaged, or lost. 36,000 households were affected, and about 1,000 households were completely displaced. People had to abandon their homes to escape from the floodwaters. So last year was something of a disaster, catastrophe, and we cannot live on hope. We need to make a plan, and our plan must help to relieve Guyana from the type of suffering that comes about every year. The May-June season last year started in the last week of April, and the daily volume of rainfall was about 4,318 millimeters in regions 1, that is the Barima Waini, region 3, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and 10. And the average rainfall was 2,286 millimeters in regions 2, that is the Pomeroon Supernam, 4, the Demerara Mahaica, and 9, the Rupununi. The average rainfall has been between 762 millimeters and 1,542 millimeters in 2015 and 2020 May-June season. But you can see what happened last year. The rainfall multiplied several times over, creating misery for the people living in those regions that I just called. Now, Guyana's rainy season is influenced without escape by what is called the El Nino Southern Oscillation, ENSO. Many people, don't understand El Nino, but it is really a system that occurs in the Central Pacific off of the coast of South America, and the Pacific coast of South America, and in northern South America, but we cannot change where We are. Guyana is fixed in its present location. So we will always be affected by the weather systems in ENSO, that is the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And once this happens, we'll be susceptible to cycles of drought and flood. Climate changes all the time. It is in continuous change and it is inevitable. And the Earth's temperature was about 0.88 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels in 2010. By 2019, a decade later, it rose to 1.1 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. So you see what is happening. Within the space of a decade, from 2010 to 2019, global warming has increased from zero point 0.8 degrees centigrade to 1.1 degrees centigrade. And these extreme events that we are witnessing, heat waves on the land and the ocean, extensive fires that you witness, forest fires, heat charged hurricanes, record rainfall and flooding all around the world have been occurring over the past decade. And by just raising world or global temperatures by 1 degree centigrade, you can see the changes, the deleterious changes taking place everywhere. So Earth's temperature has been increasing every decade since 1880, over the last 140 years or so. The rate of warming over the past 40 years alone is more than twice that as the previous decade, since 1981. Every three years, a new record is being set in terms of the rising in global temperature. So we are in a very difficult situation, not only in Guyana, but around the world. And you can see extreme weather has become more frequent and more fierce, more harsh. Heat waves are increasing. Further warming and human-induced emissions. And this month we'll be dealing with other aspects of the environment, but human-induced emissions, especially from burning and deforestation, cutting down mangroves and other trees, result in increased intensity and frequency. Look what happened in 2017. A whole family of hurricanes, Hurricane Harvey, Irma, Jose, and Maria, I call them a family. They reached unprecedented rapid intensification. You remember even Houston in southern United States was subject to floods. Hurricane Irma set a record for sustained winds of 298 kilometers per hour. That is terrible. But that is where the earth is going if it is not careful and it doesn't prepare to deal with the impact of climate change. My friends, we have to look at the question of international cooperation. We cannot deal with this alone. It is an international issue. Our country signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change at the UN Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro since 1992. We are also signed on to the Commonwealth Langkawi Declaration, which came out years before the United Nations Climate Change conferences started. The Global Environmental Facility, GEF, proposed an international mitigation strategy, which included details, retrofitting buildings to make them more energy efficient, adopting renewable energy resources such as solar and wind and hydro, helping cities to develop more sustainable transport, greater use of bicycles, less use of motor cars, more buses which can take more passengers rather than a sports car carrying just one person and a friend, and promoting more sustainable use of lands and forests. Guyana, of course, has responded my government, the APNU AFC coalition between 2015 and 2020, established a Department of Environment to comprehensively address the country's commitments under the United Nations system for climate control, for climate change. But we found out that the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory for 1994 was deficient. And the PPP administration, when it got into office in August 2020, miniaturized the Department of Environment and put it under the Ministry of Natural Resources. It used to be under the president because of the importance of the environment to the entire country. We felt that was the fittest place for it to be. Now it has been shoved off to the Ministry of Natural Resources. We don't know what's going to happen there. Our coalition government too promulgated the Green State National Development Strategy, the GSDS, the Green State Development Strategy. The PPP administration has thrown the Green State Development Strategy out of the window and picked a few ideas from it, and they brought back their own opportunistic, outdated low carbon development strategy. And we in the APNU AFC coalition promulgated a national climate change action plan after detailed consultation with the people, with civil society and other stakeholders. The plan laid out a national climate action proposal. It laid out a vision, it laid out goals, and it laid out guiding principles. Now, much of that is likely to be lost because the present administration is ignoring the good work which the APNU AFC coalition put in place to save this country from the adverse effects from climate change. It is only last week that we read in the papers that the present administration is going to provide $32 billion to tackle flooding. This is in April. Everybody knows that the May-June rains start and never fail. They start in May. That's why we call them the May-June rains. And in the end of April, the government announces that it will provide $32 billion to deal with what they call tackle flooding. Well, it's too late. It is too late. And many of the areas are going to be vulnerable to flooding because they waited a whole year without tackling flooding. And now we hear that $32 billion. Well, that money will not make an impact on the rains which have started. The rains have started already. What we need, my friends, is a master plan. We need a national floodplain management system. What we have here with the NDIA, perhaps it's suited to rice cultivation and sugar cultivation on the coastline. But as you saw last year, flooding is a whole of country phenomenon. Every single region is affected by flooding. NDIA does not have the reach, it does not have the capacity and the capability to deal with the flooding problem caused by climate change, which we saw last year, 2021. NDIA has to be superseded by some national floodplain management system, which can take a whole of country approach, which will be based on international cooperation, which will be based on legislation to enforce its implementation, which will be based on better organization. What we have now in NDIA is inadequate, and anybody who lives in Guyana would know that NDIA cannot cope with the type of flooding that we've been seeing here. All floods are local. Floods are local. Floods don't happen somewhere else. Floods are local. It means that there must be a plan which brings in the RDCs, because every region has an RDC. It brings in the neighborhood democratic councils, and in areas with heavy indigenous population, brings in the village councils as well. We have to sit around the table and discuss and work out plans to solve the problem of flooding. And especially in the riverine areas like the Kanji Creek or the Akawini Creek uh, communities and communities in the hinterland, we have to bring in the NDCs and RDCs to discuss how climate change could be, dealt with, and how the flooding could be alleviated. And this is not something for central government alone. This has to be decentralized to the RDCs and NDCs. And we had established the APN UFC coalition and re-established, I can say, something called the Guyana People's Militia. People are fiddling with it again, but the whole idea is that every region should have a company of militia. So when there is an environmental emergency, the regional chairman or the regional democratic council could call out the militia, which is made up of volunteers, to help to carry out relief operations. And I hope that that plan will be continued by the present administration. It has worked before, and all over the country, we have thousands of militiamen who can be called out. They're not full-time soldiers, but they can be called out to assist. Some of them were recruited to assist in the COVID pandemic, and I hope that they are still on the records of the Guyana Defense Force. But they can help to respond to emergencies. This plan that I speak about, the National Floodplain Management System, will have several tasks. It has to monitor climate change. Climate change is happening all the time, and its impact could be seen in the forests, in the rivers, and throughout the landscape, these 10 landscapes that Guyana likes to boast about, the islands and the lowlands and the grasslands and so on. Uh, the system will be based on a communications network. Again, our coalition administration created something called the Regional Public Broadcasting Service, the RPBS. We had broadcasting stations in Aishalton, in Oriala, in Mabaruma, in Madia, all over the country. Every region was about to get a regional broadcasting service so that when there's flooding, warning could be given to all of the residents of the region. You don't have to wait until the newspaper comes from Georgetown. Your region, the regional chairman, the regional democratic council could inform all of the entire community through this regional public broadcasting service. This is something that the APN-UFC coalition created. We must have early warning so that our canals, our trenches, and our waterways are maintained. The outfalls of our rivers, which easily get silted up, must be cleaned so that they can discharge the excess water during heavy rainfall. And this is one of the problems. Since all of our rivers flow from south to north into the Atlantic, the outfalls have to be cleared because they all get silted up. This is what happens in the Pomeroon. This is what happens in the Kanji. This is what happens in Demerara. This is what happens in Nebari, Mahaika. This is nothing new. And we need to have a national floodplain management system so that every region can monitor the rivers. And if you didn't realize it, every region is named after rivers. So that is one of the characteristics of our regional administration. Region 1 is Barima Waini, and these are massive rivers. Region 2, Pomeroon, Supanam, and so on. So we need a national system. And this is my proposal. This is my recommendation to the government of Guyana. We need to create this national floodplain management system because flooding is recurrent in Guyana. Every year, and now we're in May, June, we are going to have more floods. And we cannot go about it in an ad hoc manner. Flooding in Guyana cannot be solved with food hampers and handouts. We need a serious plan, and we call upon the government of Guyana to get away from this food hamper bit, going wrong, giving little hampers, like sharing out cutlasses and hose to communities. We need a serious plan to protect our citizens, our Niklita Amsterdam in Barakara, people in Akawini, people in Kokwani, where sometimes the floodwaters of the river, the Berbice River can rise like 3 meters, overnight. And it probably will rise 3 meters during this heavy rainy season. So we call upon the administration to adopt a national floodplain management system to protect the ordinary poor people of this country living up the creeks and waterways and also in the towns and villages of this country. This is something we need. The rains are upon us. It is May, June, and my friends, May, June rains never fail. May God bless you and keep you safe and dry.
Let us cooperate for the younger. Let us cooperate for our land. Let us resolve to fight together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can.
Each man must do his